President, I rise to explain to the chamber to the wider community why I oppose the Trade and Foreign Investment Protecting the Public Interest Bill of 2014. And I read from the explanatory memorandum as supplied by our colleague Senator Whish-Wilson, and it reads as this: the purpose of the bill is to prevent the Commonwealth from entering into an agreement with one or more foreign countries that includes an investor-state dispute settlement provision. Now, I've got to say at the outset I have a lot of respect for Senator Whish-Wilson. He was well educated at Guildford Grammar School, as I understand, in Western Australia. He studied at university in Western Australia. He has a good, sound understanding of economics and commerce. He worked in the stock exchanges, as I understand it, in Western Australia, in Hong Kong, in New York, in Sydney. So Senator Whish-Wilson has a very, very good understanding of the world of commerce and particularly the world of international trade. And he also understands, Acting Deputy President, that in a country that has the land mass of continental USA and the population of New York City, that Senator Whish-Wilson understands that the high level of per capita income and wealth and socio-economics in this country indeed is due to our exporting capacity. We are not like America. We can't consume the majority of what we produce. We're not like China, which of course also can consume. We must rely on exports, we must rely on the inflow of capital, and we must rely on the rule of law, and we must of course rely on being important players on the world stage. I say again, Section 3 of the explanatory memorandum sets out that the intention of the bill is to prevent the Commonwealth from entering into agreements with foreign countries that include investor-state dispute settlement clauses. Now, Acting Deputy President, how harsh would this be for our little country of 23 million people if we were denied access to the export markets of the world upon which we have relied for so long, which we will need to rely on in the future to sustain the economic wealth and well-being of all of our citizens, and indeed to improve the well-being and the socio-economic conditions of those in our neighbouring and trading regions, Asia, Africa, India and, of course, Central America and Latin America. It is interesting that in his second reading speech, Senator Whish-Wilson draws attention to the fact the Australian government is currently being sued under the ISDS clauses as a result of legislative decision the previous government took to allow cigarettes to be sold in plain packaging. Now, that's a 1993 agreement, Acting Deputy President. It's 22 years old. Now, surely everybody in this place realises that we have moved on in terms of the quality of legislation that is 22 years old. But I also remind the chamber that this is not yet a settled matter. It is not yet a matter that has had any sort of a resolution or a judgment. And I share concerns. We sat in the committee together. I share the concerns of academics and others. I also share the concerns as expressed by the Chief Justice, again a fine Western Australian jurist in Robert French. But at the same time, the role of government, Acting Deputy President, is to balance these inputs and to arrive at decisions that are in the best interests of our country. And I do want to spell some of those out. I want to point out, if I may, in the time that is available to me, where some of the pitfalls would come if indeed we were to pass legislation that prevents the Commonwealth. Doesn't caution the Commonwealth, doesn't give the Commonwealth any leeway in this. It prevents the Commonwealth entering into an agreement with ISDS provisions. Well, of course, this blanket prohibition would completely and utterly limit us the opportunity to negotiate into the future with foreign countries, be they for imports or be they for exports. We couldn't conclude negotiations which would benefit Australian producers, consumers, investors, the broader community, or indeed those communities in the countries with which we have such valuable trading relations, and it would impose on the Commonwealth a significant limitation on the ability to be able to pursue our broader trade and investment objectives. Now, we've spent a lot of time in the last few days, as we have in the last couple of years, in this place debating how we are going to sustain and improve the socio-economic well-being of our country, how we are going to be able to meet the social demands that are so eloquently debated in this place. But, Acting Deputy President, you know as well as Senator Fifield said so well the other day, that if the economic agenda and the social agenda are not in alignment, it will be to the demise of each of them. And unfortunately, what this bill, if passed, would do would be to totally limit the opportunity for our economic expansion, particularly at a time, and I feel remiss with the Finance Minister here, Senator Cormann, because he's so much better versed than I am, to be able to comment on the black clouds that are confronting the world at the moment, as we look at what might happen with Greece defaulting or indeed jumping into bed with Russia, whose economic circumstances at the moment would be such that you'd wonder how Russia would be able to bail Greece out of its current debt crisis. When we look at other countries in Europe that are faced with the circumstances they are, when we have a look at the United States of America, whose interest on their debt, not the debt, the interest on their debt, is $1 billion per working day at the moment, $250 billion they are borrowing. Now, Senator Whish-Wilson understands this much better than I, and as well as the Finance Minister does. It all points to me, Acting Deputy President, that we must remember we are an exporting country. But of course, this blanket prohibition that's proposed in the bill, it's inconsistent with the government's policy, which is to consider the inclusion of ISDS provisions in any free trade or other agreements on a case-by-case basis. It denies the government the opportunity to actually negotiate on a case-by-case. It says, no, sorry, we can't deal with China, we can't deal with Japan, we can't deal with Korea, we couldn't have dealt with Singapore, not allowed to deal with the Trans-Pacific Partnership because we are prevented from even participating. Now, nobody in Australia, and I don't think Senator Whish-Wilson indeed wants to see that. What we do want to see is a very, very much cultured discussion about those elements which are sacrosanct to Australia. And I go back to the point that the 1993 provision is 22 years old. It wasn't being considered 22 years ago. Possibly it could have been predicted 22 years ago, but nobody's suggesting today that the sorts of agreements that we are negotiating and contemplating have not moved on and are not taking into account those environmental and health and other concerns about which we are, of course, so focused. The bill proceeds from the view that ISDS invariably represents an unacceptable risk to the public interest and that all provisions are equally severe. Now, we are conscious of potential risks, and I would rely on the excellence of the Trade Minister leading and directing the bureaucrats in the department who are now so well versed in the processes of international trade negotiations, to be able to govern, to be able to regulate in the public interest in areas such as health and the environment. And on this topic, if I may, Acting Deputy President, I'd be amazed if in his previous work Senator Whish-Wilson hasn't come across similar clients. As a businessman myself, in the last decade engaged in business activities in Asia, in the Middle East and on the African subcontinent, the Indian subcontinent. ISDS doesn't just apply to ogres wanting to come into Australia. ISDS gives a level of protection to industry, Australian industry, operating overseas. Vitally important because we have the opportunity, and indeed in my view, particularly in the field of agribusiness in which I spend a lot of my professional time, I think we have a compulsion to actually increase our agribusiness activities overseas. And I, for one, would be saying, in any sorts of agreements that Australia is negotiating, Acting Deputy President, that I would want to see our government, I would want to see our trade negotiators making sure that the interests of Australian business are being protected. And indeed, if we were to prevent the Commonwealth from entering into agreements, we are cutting off the opportunity for Australian businesses operating overseas to enjoy the protection of ISDS clauses. It's a two-way exercise. It is not just a one-way exercise. The bill in its current form fails to recognise that agreements containing ISDS can incorporate safeguards to protect the rights of governments and the communities they represent to take decisions in the public interest. The bill suggests that this is not possible. I say that it is. In fact, just the recent agreement, negotiated again by Trade Minister Rob, leading the delegation of people undertook it with the Republic of Korea, contain many safeguards, many more safeguards indeed, than earlier agreements. This is how policy works, this is how democracy works, this is how government works. We should always be moving to improve what has gone before us. In the case of Korea, these safeguards have been developed in response to concerns about challenges to legitimate public welfare regulation. And I, for one, enjoyed the opportunity to participate in the committee and to hear the legitimate concerns of people who indeed not only have the expertise but defend the time. Two opportunities, for example, or two instances in the case of Korea, where we were not freezing existing policy settings, was in fact to do with intellectual property and the environment chapter. So exactly the concern that Senator Whish-Wilson and Senator Wright have expressed, exactly that concern saw itself played out. Indeed, we have ISDS clauses in 4 existing free trade agreements, 21 bilateral investment treaties, binding obligations that have been ongoing over 25 years. And I remind those listening that we've only ever faced and are facing now one claim that has not yet been tested and has not yet been resolved. Not bad for a country of 23 million people that exports more than 65% of its produce around the world. Acting Deputy President, who in fact are the players? Well, in the bilateral investment treaties that we are considering, more than 90% of the 2,500 in force have operated without a single investor claim. We know that the inflow of capital is vital to this country. And of course the inflow of capital reflects the claims. The Europeans about 50% and about 47% of the claims. The United States, the next biggest player in this game from Australia's point of view, 24% of FDI stock outflow from them, 22% of the claims. It is indeed in the resources sector where most of the claims have been made, because they are the sectors in which there is the greatest degree of state involvement. And I hope to come to Mexico in a few moments by way of illustration. So mining, oil and gas resources, those with the greatest input by states. The disputes have been mainly around countries with weak legal institutions. 53 claims, Argentina. 36 claims, Venezuela. They're the 2 leading respondent states. About a third of all ISDS cases are settled in advance of a ruling, and of course this is the case that people come to realise that it's as expensive to run an ISDS claim as indeed it is to go through the commercial legal process. So when we see that treaty-based investment protection indeed represents a major advance, Acting Deputy President, in the fair treatment of aliens and the peaceful resolution of disputes. When you consider the alternatives, withdrawing from these treaties, which is the logical conclusion should the good senator's bill be accepted, then the negative consequences for economic growth in this country and the rule of law are there for all to see. I want to continue now in terms of what those opportunities are. We are an economy of some $1.6 trillion. The services sector contributes about 70%, about $1.12 trillion of that economic activity. But at the moment, the services sector only contributes 17%. $57 billion of $330 billion towards export income. Therein lies the opportunity for this country, is for us to radically increase the contribution of the services sector to export earnings, as indeed resources earnings go down because of the decline oil prices and indeed gas prices and of course iron ore and other resources. So you turn and you say, well, OK, that's all well and good, Senator Back. Where are these opportunities? Where are these opportunities for increasing in the services sector from 17%? Imagine, Finance Minister, if the services sector expanded its export activity from 17 to 34%. And do you know where the answer lies? It lies in those countries with which we have just concluded free trade agreements. Because when Minister Rob briefed us over the value of the Chinese free trade agreement to our country, as a person involved in agriculture and resources, I was thinking this is wonderful. We already export a lot of iron ore. In fact, for your interest, Acting Deputy President, we actually export 19 tonnes of iron ore per person to our overseas markets. We did that in 2014. But in fact, what Minister Rob told us was that what the Chinese actually want is access to our services. They want further access, for example, to our education services, which indeed last year contributed some I just can't pick up the number of dollars now, the dollars of value of the education services to Australia last year, but it was in the order of $2 billion. The value of tourism from China to this country in excess of $1 billion. So just those two services alone, higher education and tourism. But when you add into that, Deputy President, the opportunity for services exported for governance, for prudential regulation, for insurance purposes, the fact that that particular free trade agreement has now guaranteed that Australian service providers will be able to construct, renovate and wholly operate Australian-owned hotels and restaurants in China. How often have we heard, well, of course, it's all well and good, they can come here to our country, but we can't do the same in this. Well, under this agreement, we can. And if indeed the provisions of Senator Whish-Wilson's bill had have prevailed, we would not. Australian travel agencies, for example, and tour operators are now able to establish wholly Australian-owned subsidiaries in China for tours within China for domestic and foreign travellers. And remember, in 2014, 100 million Chinese actually travelled outside their country, and it's predicted by 2016 that will double. Another area of services that they desperately want and need from us has led to the decision under the Free Trade Agreement that China will permit wholly owned Australian hospitals and aged care institutions to be established in China and run and managed by Australians. Just three examples: in hospitality, in tourism, in the health sector, hospital sector, the aged care sector, and, as I say, the value of higher education. Just one country. We expand that to Japan, which also has an ageing population, an opportunity for expansion of our services sector. Mention was made by previous speakers about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Well, recent experience I had in Mexico only some 3 weeks ago, discussing with government officials and industry people, for example in the oil and gas sectors, in the hard rock mining area and the energy sector, the value of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, to Mexico has been massive. But the Mexicans said we cannot wait for the inclusion of more Australian investment. At their Geological Survey Institution, they showed me proudly the geological map of Mexico at the 1 in 250,000 level, and the fact that in those mineral-rich areas of Mexico, they've actually now mapped it at 1 in 50,000. They then turned to me, through you, Acting Deputy President, to Senator Whish-Wilson, and they said, do you know where we got that expertise from, Senator Back? We got it from Geoscience Australia and we got it from the CSIRO. How proud do you think I was? And when they said that we're now sending 50,000 of our university students away every year to learn more about energy, oil and gas, what opportunities are there for Australians to get in there? In hard rock mining, in their services sector, in their corporate governance, in their insurances, in their health sector. Now that opportunity will be opened to us. But indeed, if we were to accept The provisions of this particular bill, we would be denied them because they will have ISDS provisions.
The question is, Senator Rhiannon.